Thank you, Pam. That was really generous. Thank you, Gary, for bringing us back. Wherever you are. Is Gary here? Back there. Can you all hear me in back? Yeah. Yes? Okay. So this is our second time here for Laura and me. The last time we were here, it was the fall of 2009, and I was supposed to be working on a book, but I couldn't figure out what that book was. So I actually spent most of my time with my head in the history of Berlin, which provided more than enough distraction. The book I wasn't writing had something to do with the fact that America wasn't working very well. I'd spent several years covering the war in Iraq, where there were spectacular failures on the part of certain well-known American individuals, but where you could also see on display what could be called the arteriosclerosis of American institutions. And then I came home to cover the events of 2008, the presidential campaign and the economic crisis, when one pillar after another of the American economy collapsed. Real estate, commercial banks, investment banks, car manufacturers. All of this institutional failure felt rather apocalyptic to me. I knew that it hadn't happened overnight. It must have gone back decades. It was the kind of historical subject that makes me think of writing a book. But what kind of book? Not a scholarly work of history. I'm not licensed to do that. And not a book of policy. I'm not an expert on anything. So don't expect any answers tonight. I mean that. I'm a journalist and an ex-novelist. Really a failed novelist. I like writing narrative. And it took me another year or two to think of a way to do this book. Actually, one thing that helped was reading Catherine Boo's Behind the Beautiful Forevers, her masterpiece about a slum in Mumbai. Kate's book showed me how much could be conveyed by getting out of the way. My nonfiction work always had a first-person narrator. But this time, on this subject, I felt my presence in the narrative, explaining, analyzing, showing how I got the story, would be like the guy sitting next to you at the movie who won't shut up. I began traveling around the United States, mainly to out-of-the-way places, like the Carolina Piedmont region, the old industrial city of Youngstown, Ohio, and the brand new subdivisions around Tampa Bay. I met a handful of Americans whose lives I began to think would let me tell this story. People from different backgrounds, different walks of life, but also people who were somehow representative. And I also wanted to tell the stories of a handful of the era's celebrities, 10 of them, who changed the way Americans live and think and talk, for better or worse, to show how the people at the top helped shape our society during this period, which has been a time of extreme celebrity worship. Then I had to bring all these different stories, which unfortunately never intersected in life, together into a narrative covering 35 years. That was the really hard part. So despite the absence of the first-person singular that I'd always relied on, there is, in fact, an argument in the Unwinding, an implied argument. And it comes with a caveat, because it's an argument about historical decline. And this is an argument that's often made by people after they turn 50, which is a disaster that happened to me while I was working on the book. So I want to start with this warning label. Tonight's speaker might just be talking about himself. One question that any work of narrative has to answer is where to begin. In this case, the answer is somewhat arbitrary, but not entirely. So as a thought experiment, I'm going to suggest to you that about a generation ago, and I'm paraphrasing Virginia Woolf here, in or around 1978, American character changed. And the America we know today began to take shape back then. It was, in a way, a period not unlike the present. The end of a long, unhappy war, America pulling back from its overseas commitments, into retrenchment, an economic crisis and contraction, a mood of widespread pessimism and discontent, a sense that things had gone fundamentally wrong. Back then, the reaction to this feeling is what gave us the next era, which I call the unwinding. So just briefly, I'm going to go through a few of the trends, the things that began in or around 1978, and that we now have been living with for so long that we don't even imagine they ever had a beginning. One is deindustrialization. Part of my book takes place in Youngstown, which was a steel city. Steel was the only industry in that city. The first big mill in Youngstown closed on the first day of 1978, Youngstown Sheet and Tube. And in the next 5 years, every major steel mill in that city collapsed and died, taking 50,000 jobs in a rather small economic region. There was no national policy for any of this. It happened while people stood by and watched. And if you can imagine, across the Rust Belt, millions more jobs were being lost. Youngstown was where it happened in a way first and fastest and most vividly. So you can see what it meant there, but it was happening in many other places. If all these livelihoods had been taken away by the bubonic plague, it would have been considered one of history's biggest events. But because it was an economic collapse, it's almost considered normal. One of the main characters in The Unwinding, and I always hesitate to call the people in my book characters since they actually exist, but I suppose that I've done the terrible thing of turning them into characters, so I have to use that word, is a woman named Tammy Thomas, who has spent her whole life in Youngstown. She grew up there during the death spiral of the city, when, with the collapse of steel, came an epidemic of arson, of gangs, of violence. Her mother was a heroin user. She grew up essentially raising herself, had 3 kids on her own before she was 21, and managed to get one of the very last factory jobs in Youngstown before they were all gone, on an assembly line in an auto parts factory. And when that job went south to Mexico in 2006 and 7, she had to completely remake her life, and she became a community organizer. So tonight you'll hear a couple of passages from The Unwinding, and I'm just going to start by reading a bit about Tammy Thomas. Tammy Thomas grew up on the east side of Youngstown. Years after she left, when things got bad there, and moved down to the south side, and after she left the south side, when things got bad there, and moved up to the north side, in certain moods, she would drive her metal gray 2002 Pontiac Sunfire over the expressway, which broke up the city when it came through in the late 60s, and return to look around her old neighborhood. When Tammy was coming up in the 60s and 70s, the east side was still a mixed area. Next door to her house on Charlotte Avenue, there had been an Italian family. Hungarians lived across the street. The blue house was Puerto Rican, and there were a few black homeowners too. The wide open field at the corner of Charlotte and Bruce had once been her elementary school. Down Bruce Street, there had been a church that was later hit by a storm and torn down. A few streets away on Sheehy, where 3 wooden crosses now rose from the earth, there had been a neighborhood store next to the house where Tammy's mother lived before it got firebombed. A depression that cut through the grass of 2 lots had been an alley lined with peach and apple trees. Back then, everyone raised flowers and vegetables in their yard. Around her house on Charlotte, there had been rows of Sharon, forsythia, tulips, hyacinth. As a girl, she used to sit on her front porch and look down the street and see the tops of the smokestacks. And if the wind blew right, she could smell the sulfur. The men on the east side had good jobs, most of them in the mills. Families kept up their property and were proud to own 3-story houses with gable roofs and front porches and yards, all of them big compared to a working-class home in the Northeast. The first time Tammy saw row houses in Philly, she thought, where are the yards? Where are the driveways? Back then, the mob kept things in order, so there weren't a whole lot of shenanigans going on. As Tammy drove over the crumbling asphalt of the streets, she was still amazed by the gaps and silence where there'd once been so much life. It was as if she still expected to see the old families, and the East Side had just disappeared. Where had it all gone? The things that had made it a community, stores, schools, churches, playgrounds, fruit trees, were gone, along with half the houses and 2/3 of the people. And if you didn't know the history, you wouldn't know what was missing. The East Side had never been the best part of Youngstown, but it had the most black homeowners. And to Tammy, it had always been the greenest, the least dense, the most beautiful. You could pick peaches around Lincoln Park, and now parts of it were almost returning to nature, with deer wandering across overgrown lots where people came to dump their garbage. It made her damn mad to see how McGuffey Plaza was abandoned, a model shopping mall that was built in the 50s by the Cafaro family, with a bowling alley, an A&P, a bunch of other stores, and a huge parking lot in front, now just a concrete desert, with nothing but one black hair care shop left open. It frustrated her that everyone had forgotten about the East Side. Not sad, not sentimental. She was frustrated because she hadn't given up and wouldn't slip into the resignation that had settled over Youngstown, because this city was where she had lived her whole life, and her past was still real to her, and there was still something to be done. So with the loss of the jobs that made a city like Youngstown live, came the decline of the unions that provided livelihoods for the workers. In 1978, 25% of America's private sector workforce was unionized. Last year, it was less than 7%. Today, Americans are really no longer considered workers. We are independent contractors, or maybe serial entrepreneurs. The title of a recent business book by the founder of the company LinkedIn says it all: the startup of you. We're all startups now. In place of that old industrial economy, there have been two big success stories. The first is Wall Street. Ever since the New Deal, banking had been a stable, boring business. In movies from the 40s and 50s, bankers were not Gordon Gekko or the Wolf of Wall Street. They were dull, solid pillars of the community. Investment banking, cordoned off by the iron wall of the Depression-era Glass-Steagall Act, was a closed world of private partnerships in which rich men carefully weighed their risks because they were playing with their own money. In the early 80s, investment banks started going public, and financial deregulation began. The purpose of an American company was reduced to one thing, as determined by Wall Street: shareholder value, the price of its stock. In 1978, the finance industry represented just under 5% of GDP. It's double that today, with salaries in finance far outstripping those in other professions, which helps explain why 35% of Princeton graduates every year take their talent and education to Wall Street. Some experts call this the financialization of the economy. This unleashing of the banking sector has had mixed results for the rest of the economy. Between the New Deal and the Reagan era, there was not a single financial crisis in America. The regulations were strong enough to prevent speculative bubbles, which is why recessions during those decades were much milder than they've since become. Now, we have a financial crisis every 5 years or so. And the most recent one in 2008 brought on a recession so deep that some economists call it a second depression. So the second big winner has been Silicon Valley. I grew up there before it was called Silicon Valley. I always thought it was a strange phrase because it was called the Santa Clara Valley when I was a kid. It was a pleasant, boring, very middle-class place with good California public schools. I attended them. The year I graduated from high school was 1978. Maybe that's not a coincidence. California voters that year passed a referendum that cut taxes for education so deeply that in the decades since, California schools have gone from the top to the bottom in the country's rankings. I got out just in time. The year before, in 1977, just a few miles down the road from where I went to school, came the Apple II, the first truly popular personal computer. For most ordinary Americans, that was the start of the information age. It came with a revolutionary ethos, an impatience with old structures and hierarchies, a creed of personal liberation and empowerment, a worship of innovation and disruption, which are two key words in Silicon Valley. There was, and still is, a sense that the digital age could establish a new economy, a new social order. Technology has changed the way we live, write, read, talk, teach, and amuse ourselves. But if you ever look up from your mobile device, you can't help noticing that the information revolution, while making workers more efficient and productive, and a few very smart people incredibly rich, also employs far fewer people than Tammy Thomas's old industrial economy. Lots of young people in cities like Brooklyn, where I live, seem to spend all day in cafes working for free on Google, Facebook, and Twitter. Until the 70s, most business leaders wanted nothing to do with Washington. Then, with the economic troubles of that decade, they began to realize that their fortunes could be made or broken by the federal government, and the profession of lobbying took off. Today, very little happens in Washington without the consent of well-funded special interests. I call it organized money. It's existed ever since the First Amendment of the Constitution enshrined the right to petition the government for redress of grievances. But when you take away the laws and norms holding this power in check, as happened in the age of the robber barons 100 years ago and is happening again in our time, organized money is the default force in American life. Over the past few years, and maybe we'll hear more about this on Sunday when Justice Sotomayor comes here, two hugely important Supreme Court decisions removed most of the limits on campaign spending that had been passed by Congress. According to the majority justices' reasoning, which is either astonishingly naive or else disingenuous, money doesn't influence politicians unless it's a direct quid pro quo. Write me a check and I'll do this for you. Of course, it never happens in such a way, but it happens all the time. Just last month, a study was published by two political scientists that found that over the past 3 decades, the chances of a new policy becoming law are less than 1 in 5 if the economic elites oppose it, even if the majority of voters support it. According to some news organizations, the study proved that America is not a democracy but an oligarchy. So because of the importance of organized money, I knew it was essential to have in the Unwinding a story of Washington. And that became the story of a young man named Jeff Connaughton, who started out as a starstruck young aide to Joe Biden when Biden was in the Senate, till he began to realize that Biden could give a great speech but wasn't a particularly nurturing boss. He left government, went through the revolving door that half of aides and congressmen and senators passed through in Washington, and became a lobbyist. And that's when his career really took off. Suddenly, he was making more money than he had ever thought possible. As he said to me, "No one has ever heard of me, and I'm making more than $1 million a year just because I worked on Capitol Hill." Here's a short passage describing a day in the life of a Washington lobbyist. Jeff Connaughton, by the way, worked for a firm called Quinn Gillespie, which was the first red-blue lobbying firm. In other words, they represented both Democrats and Republicans, and as they like to say, we actually represent the Green Party. A Quinn Gillespie fundraising event was typically a breakfast in the firm's conference room, a bacon and eggs buffet on a Tuesday, Wednesday, or Thursday, the only mornings when senators were reliably in Washington. It would start around 8, but Connaughton could not count the times a senator would wander in at 7:45, and he would think, "Oh shit, we're both half awake, and I have to entertain him for 15 minutes." As the host, he or Jack Quinn would give the senator an over-the-top introduction. One of the great public servants of our time and personally a wonderful human being, he called me when my child was sick over to the senator, who would tell a couple of lame jokes, the clients would laugh, and then they'd get down to business. When Connaughton started out in lobbying, it was considered unseemly to combine raising money with discussing issues. But that line, like so much else, eroded over time. And eventually a pro like Chris Dodd, who was always loose and fun with his red face and dark eyebrows and thick white senatorial hair, would just go around the conference table and ask each donor, what do you care about? What do you care about? What do you care about? 3 weeks after the event, Connaughton would call the senator's chief of staff, who would say, hold on, the senator wants to talk to you directly, for Connaughton was now part of the senator's political family. After a year without a second event, it would become almost impossible to get the senator on the phone, and Connaughton would have to schedule another breakfast. Finally, in 1978, American politics changed. That year, the conservative movement came to Washington in the midterm congressional elections, 2 years before the election of Ronald Reagan, led by a history professor from Georgia named Newt Gingrich. The New Right was a grassroots movement, in some ways kind of an extension of the 60s, nominally more democratic, less hierarchical, more driven by personalities than by party structures. Now, suspicion of government has been in the American DNA since the Revolutionary War against the British Crown, but this latest strain came with elements of fundamentalism, even nihilism. The anti-government philosophy of today's conservatives has a self-fulfilling strategy. Make government unworkable, and it won't work. And then Americans will turn against it. It's really pretty easy, actually. You could see this cycle in action last October when conservatives in Washington decided to shut down the federal government. And as a result, Americans' trust in government fell to an all-time low. Meanwhile, there have been more filibusters in the Senate over the past 5 years than the previous 80. Newt Gingrich did not invent modern political polarization, but I think he did more than anyone to shape the toxic politics and the political language that we live with every day. History might well judge him more important than Reagan or Clinton or even Obama, which is why he's one of the 10 celebrities profiled in the Unwinding. Now we come to the mother of all trends, which is inequality. Starting in 1973, average wages, adjusted for inflation, started to stagnate. And other than a blip upward in the 90s, the line has remained flat for 40 years. Income inequality began to rise a few years later, around 1978, and it has never stopped going up. In 78, the top 1% of Americans had around 8% of the country's pre-tax income. Today, it's 25%, the highest level since the 20s. Now, in case these numbers make your eyes glaze over, here's one that stayed with me. The 6 surviving heirs to the Walmart family fortune own the same amount of wealth as the bottom 42% of all Americans. Today, America is as unequal as it was in the age of the robber barons. Last month came the news that the American middle class, for the first time in history, is poorer than the middle class of other advanced economies, such as Germany's, and the poorest Americans are much poorer. Now, the interesting thing is that if you graph and measure all these trends, if you put them on transparencies across each other over the years since 78, income inequality, political polarization, the decline of unions, special interest money, the financialization of the economy, they line up almost perfectly, which leads you to think they must somehow be connected. So what's behind them? Some of the factors are worldwide changes under no one's control. Globalization, the inflation and oil shocks of the 70s, the growth of foreign competition after a long period of American dominance following World War II. There have also been historic technological changes that have favored the most educated Americans, have been hard on those with skills requiring less education, and been positively cruel to Americans with neither education nor skills. But other advanced economies in Canada, Europe, and elsewhere have experienced these same factors with less extreme results. The effects I've described have been more extreme in America than anywhere else. This takes us beyond economic forces to the country's politics and culture. In America, the unwinding has meant the end of the deal that once existed among Americans. And the end of that deal was man-made. It came from human choices. Some of them took the form of new laws, new policies, but perhaps the most important changes were in manners and morals, norms of acceptable behavior, social codes, standards of responsibility, of public spiritedness, and self-restraint. So what was the deal? It was an unwritten social contract among Americans, signed in invisible ink by the leaders of government, business, and labor, and applied to elites and ordinary people alike. It gave people a slice of the pie and a place in the sun. I call this the period of the Roosevelt Republic. Now, we all know that the post-war years contained plenty of injustice. If you were black or female or gay, America made very little room for you. Life could be stifling, conformist, authoritarian, intrusive. And yet, those years also offered the means of redressing the very wrongs they contained. For example, strong government, enlightened business, and activist labor were important bulwarks of the civil rights movement. Now, maybe the Roosevelt Republic was a 50-year blip, an exception to the big American story, a product of Cold War bipartisanship, U.S. global economic supremacy in a post-war world we largely created, with tax rates and levels of state intrusion that Americans are never likely to accept again. But it was also an ethos, and it took an active effort to tear it to pieces, which is what's happened. The deal guaranteed that the benefits of the economic growth following the Second World War were widely distributed, more widely, and with more shared prosperity than at any time in human history. The deal said that a CEO didn't get paid $80 million for 10 weeks of work, which was the good fortune of the head of Time Warner Cable just a few weeks ago. The tax code restricted the amount of wealth that could be accumulated in private hands and passed on from one generation to the next, thereby preventing the formation of an inherited plutocracy. And related to this shared prosperity, during the post-war years, political participation reached an all-time high. At the same time, the country's elites played a role that today is almost unrecognizable. That is to say, they actually saw themselves as custodians of national institutions and interests. Now, the heads of banks, corporations, universities, law firms, foundations, media organizations were not less or more venal or meretricious or greedy than their counterparts today. Human nature doesn't change. But they rose to the top in a culture that put a brake on these traits and didn't glorify them. Call it hypocrisy. It's underrated. Today, instead of elites, we have celebrities. They dominate the landscape like giant monuments to aspiration, fulfillment, and overreach. They are as intimate as they are grand. They offer themselves for worship to ordinary people, searching for a suitable object of devotion. In times of widespread opportunity, the distance between these gods and the mortals closes. The monuments shrink closer to human size. The lives of American celebrities become gossipy diversions. But they loom larger in times like this, when inequality is soaring, trust in institutions is falling, and the normal paths of upward mobility are blocked. Celebrities no longer rise with their fellow Americans, they rise from them. They constitute their own superclass. They hang out at the same TED Talks, big idea conferences, and fundraising galas. They appear on the same talk shows, invest in one another's projects, wear one another's brand apparel, champion one another's causes, marry one another, and cheat on one another with one another. They can be found in every sector of society, including ones that seem less than glamorous. We have celebrity bankers. There's Jamie Dimon. Celebrity computer engineers, Sergey Brin. Real estate developers, Donald Trump. Journalists, Anderson Cooper. Biologists, Craig Venter. Restaurant owners, Alice Waters. There's often a quality of self-invention to their rise. Mark Zuckerberg went from awkward geek to the subject of a Hollywood hit. Sean Carter turned into Jay-Z. Martha Kostyra became Martha Stewart, and then Martha Stewart Living. The person evolves into a persona, then a brand, then an empire, with the business imperative of grow or die. Now, this process of expansion transgresses boundaries by substituting celebrities in place of institutions. Instead of robust public education, we have Mark Zuckerberg's rescue of Newark schools. Instead of a vibrant literary culture, we have Oprah's book club. Instead of federal investment in basic scientific research, we have the Gates Foundation and Eric Schmidt's Ocean Institute. Celebrities either buy institutions or disrupt them. After all, if you are the institution, you don't need to play by its rules. Zuckerberg's foundation myth begins with a disciplinary proceeding at Harvard, which leads him to drop out and found a company whose motto is move fast and break things. Jay-Z's history as a crack dealer isn't just a hard luck story, it's celebrated by his fans and not least by himself as an early sign of hustle and smarts. Martha Stewart's jail time for perjury merely proved that her will to win was indomitable. These new celebrities live by the hacker's code. Ask forgiveness, not permission. They obliterate old distinctions between high and low culture, serious and trivial endeavors, profit-making and philanthropy, leading to the phenomenon of being famous for being famous. So an activist singer, Bono, is given a lucrative role in Facebook's IPO. A patrician politician, Al Gore, becomes a plutocratic media executive and tech investor. One of America's richest men, Michael Bloomberg, until recently ruled its largest city. The inevitable next step is for Kim Kardashian to sit on the board of a tech startup, host a global poverty awareness event, and write a book on pop neuroscience. Celebrity monuments of our age have grown so huge that they dwarf the aspirations of ordinary people who are asked to yield their dreams to the gods, to flash their favorite singer's corporate logo at concerts, to pour open their lives and data on Facebook, to adopt Apple as a lifestyle. Our stars dangle before us the myth that in America anything is possible if only you have the right attitude. But we know they aren't really inviting us to think we can be just like them. Their success is based on leaving the rest of us behind. Now, of the 10 celebrities that I profile in The Unwinding, I think the one who best captures the essence of celebrity is Oprah Winfrey. And I'll read a short passage from my sketch of her life. Her bond with her viewers was unbreakable. Many of them had never had a black person in their living room before except on a sitcom. And she made them less lonely, more tolerant and open, more curious about books and ideas, while they made her unimaginably rich. As she got bigger and bigger, from $100 million a year to $260 million, from $725 million net worth to $1.5 billion, from unforgivable acts between couples and women who are allergic to their husbands, to change your life and the seat of the soul, from Lori the abuse victim to Maya Angelou the abuse victim. She never lost the love of her audience. As she spent more and more of her time on camera with her friends Tom and Julia and Diane and Tony and Maria and Arnold and Barack and Michelle, celebrities celebrating celebrity, her most loyal friends were still her 7 million day in, day out viewers. As the end of her typical day had her flying back from Rancho La Puerta to Chicago on her private jet. It's great to have a private jet. Anyone who tells you that having your own private jet isn't great is lying. to attend Stedman's book party on the top of Michael Jordan's restaurant, arriving in a state of rage because the National Enquirer had just published unauthorized photos of the ornate marble, satin, velvet, and silk furnishings in her lakefront condo. I'm not done with that sentence. Her most ardent supporters remained the aging, lower-middle-class women from Rockford and Eau Claire who lined up for hours outside Harpo Studios on the near West Side. They had things that Oprah didn't. Children, debts, spare time. They consumed the products she advertised but would never buy. Maybelline, Jenny Craig, Little Caesars, IKEA. As their financial troubles grew, she would thrill them by selecting one of them and wiping out her debts on the air, or buying her a house, or ramping up Oprah's favorite things at Christmas to give away luxury items like diamond watches and Tory Burch gray flannel totes. But being instructed in Oprah's magical thinking, vaccinations cause autism, positive thoughts lead to wealth, love, and success, watching Oprah always doing more, owning more, not all her viewers began to live their best life. They didn't have 9 houses, or maybe any house. They couldn't call John Travolta their friend. The laws of the universe left them vulnerable to mugging. They were not always attuned to their divine self. They were never all that they could be. And since there was no random suffering in life, Oprah left them with no excuse. So when the middle class hollows out and inequality reaches levels such as we see today, people begin to feel that the game is rigged, that they no longer have a place at the table, that they're disposable. Some of the characters in my book feel that way as they become more conscious of the forces of history pressing on them. During their adult lifetimes, the period covered by my book, the character of America has changed. It's become more free and also less fair, more diverse and less secure. It's more inclusive and more stratified. There are more choices, but they exist in a world without solid structures. There's more social equality and less economic equality, much less. We now have gay Boy Scouts in America, but the chances are they attend lousy public schools. The upheavals of the unwinding have come with an intoxicating vision of democratization, flattening hierarchies, discarding old elites, and empowering individuals. You find this rhetoric in all the important sectors: politics, business, finance, technology, even culture. Think of the writer and reader in the age of Amazon's self-publishing platform, with Jeff Bezos promising the end of the gatekeepers. Think of the professional reporter in the age of the citizen journalist on Twitter or Reddit. But across sectors, the result is always the same. When you tear down the old structures, wealth and power become concentrated in fewer hands. The old institutions might have been cozy and corrupt, but they provided a check on the law of winner take all. For some Americans, the surface of life has dramatically improved. Just think of HBO, Lipitor, Google, FedEx, hand-brewed coffee, the Index 500 fund, Amazon Prime. But the institutions that underpin a healthy democracy have fallen into a state of decadence. We have all the information in the universe at our fingertips, while our most basic problems go unsolved year after year. All around, we see dazzling change, but no progress. A few years ago, a Wall Street company that nobody's heard of, called Spread Networks, dug an 800-mile trench under farms, rivers, and mountains between Chicago and New York, and laid fiber optic cable connecting the Chicago Mercantile Exchange and the New York Stock Exchange. This feat of infrastructure building, which cost $300 million, shaved 3 milliseconds off high-speed, high-volume automated trades, a big competitive advantage. Just 2 months ago, another firm nobody's heard of, called Anova, turned on infrared laser beams that will be able to make these cross-country trades in a matter of nanoseconds. with the ultimate goal of getting to zero. But passenger trains between Chicago and New York run barely faster than 1950 speeds. And we no longer have the political will to build faster ones. We can upgrade our iPhones, but we can't fix our roads and bridges. We get hundreds of TV channels on the iPad, but in the past decade, 20 newspapers have closed down all their foreign bureaus. We have touchscreen voting machines, but in 2012, turnout of registered voters fell below 60%. Solving fundamental problems with a can-do practicality, the very thing the world used to associate with America, and that redeemed Americans in the eyes of foreigners and ourselves from our vulgarity and arrogance, now seems beyond our reach. History does not rewind. There is no going back to the Roosevelt Republic. Liberals have been waiting for the second New Deal ever since 1978, and it hasn't come. Today, what I see is a tremendous amount of public unhappiness without an overarching idea to tap and channel it in a positive way. Some people thought that Occupy Wall Street was that idea. Others thought it was the Tea Party, and others thought it was Barack Obama. But none of them have been able to jump on the horse of public opinion and ride it. They've all been thrown off. Instead, there are thousands of small eruptions of energy around the country, local ideas of change and reform, most of them in places and involving people we've never heard of. Without that overarching idea, Americans tend to fall back on the individualism that is perhaps the oldest and deepest current in our life. It's a tremendously powerful force, and it can be harnessed for good or ill. I'll end tonight with my book's main character, who embodies that spirit of American individualism for better and worse. His name is Dean Price. He's a son of the Piedmont region of North Carolina, where tobacco and textiles used to provide a decent living and have disappeared. It's deep red America. It doesn't get any more conservative. His father was a failed preacher who was abusive to Dean and ended up committing suicide. And all of Dean's life, he wanted to escape the shadow of what he called his father's failure thinking, to become independent, financially independent. He starts a chain of truck stops and fast food restaurants, but he finds that he can't compete with the big oil companies and Walmart. So instead, he decides to make his own fuel, biodiesel, from crushed canola seeds and waste restaurant oil. And Dean believes, with an intense visionary sort of fervor, that this is how he will make his own fortune and also revive his fallen community. Once driving through Cleveland County, Dean happened to pass the Hard-Shell Baptist Church that his father had once tried to get but failed, the failure that had broken his father's will. Dean had gone down with his father to Cleveland County and heard the sermon his father had given for his audition back around 1975, so that decades later, he recognized the church. And he also noticed that there was now a fucking Bojangles right next door. For Dean, Bojangles, the Germans in the audience may not know about Bojangles, but the Americans surely do, had come to represent everything that was wrong with the way Americans lived, how they raised their food and transported it across the country, how they grew the crops to feed the animals they ate, the way they employed the people who worked in the restaurants, the way the money left the community. Everything about it was wrong. Dean's own business, gas and fast food, had become hateful to him, and he saw the error of his ways, as his father never had. And the conjunction of his father's legacy and his own struck him with bitter irony as he drove past. He was seeing beyond the surfaces of the land to its hidden truths. Some nights he sat up late on his front porch with a glass of Jack and listened to the trucks heading south on 220, carrying crates of live chickens to the slaughterhouses, always under cover of darkness like a vast and shameful trafficking. Chickens pumped full of hormones that left them too big to walk. And he thought how these same chickens might return from their destination as pieces of meat to his floodlit Bojangles up the hill from his house. And that meat would be drowned into bubbling fryers by employees whose hatred of the job would leak into the cooked food. And that food would be served up and eaten by customers who would grow obese and end up in the hospital in Greensboro with diabetes or heart failure, a burden to the public. And later, Dean would see them riding around the Mayodan Walmart in electric carts because they were too heavy to walk the aisles of a supercenter, just like hormone-fed chickens. The traffic on 220, the lifeblood of his chain, made him think about all those engines burning, all those millions of gallons of gas that came from America's enemies overseas, and the millions of dollars leaking out of the local economy to the oil companies and the big box stores. He would pull his truck into a Marathon gas station to fill up and notice the logo above the pump with the words, "All roads lead to liberty," written across a flag in the shape of the U.S. map. And it would make him a little crazy to think of people around here buying into such hypocritical bullshit. They had grown dependent on the corporations and lost their independent spirit. They were supposed to be Americans, not Americanes. But democracy was in one of those stages of decline. Dean was an optimist, a latter-day Horatio Alger. There was no Armageddon without the rapture. He fervently believed that out of this collapse would come a new birth. A whole new way of life would emerge right here in Rockingham County and around the country. In a decade or so, the whole landscape would be different. There might be no more Walmarts. Exxon and Archer Daniels Midland would be moribund, brainless, obsolete. With gas up to $6 or $7 a gallon, instead of centralization and long-distance transportation and everything on a huge scale, the new economy would be decentralized, local, and small scale. Rural areas like the Piedmont were on the cusp of revival, and everything they needed was right at hand, riches in the fallow fields. In the age of riverboat travel, there'd been a grist mill every 50 miles or so, where people produced flour using water power. In the coming years, small fuel refineries and meat processors would spring up every 50 miles on Route 220. Instead of mass production, it would be production by the masses. The future would take America back into its past. In 20 years, nothing would be recognizable. It would be a difficult transformation, but on the other side lay an absolutely beautiful America. That's all I have to say for tonight. Thank you. So, thank you. I warned you that I do not have answers to your policy questions, but you can ask them anyway. We'll try to have a conversation. Yes.
In the course of your travels and the people you met, was there anything that gave you hope?
I think this lecture was more depressing than the book. If you read the book, and it will be published in German by S. Fisher next month or the month after, the hope is in these crazy Americans like Dean Price, and in these gritty women like Tammy Thomas, and in people like Jeff Connaughton, who I didn't describe this, but after being a lobbyist and getting rich, realizes that it's kind of a racket and ends up going back in the government to try to make Wall Street pay the price for the financial crisis. So there is this resilience and resourcefulness among people. Everywhere you go, you find it everywhere. It just doesn't have a name or a large-scale movement to give it visibility, but it's there. So the hope for me is just in the dreams of these people who I spent so much time with. It's not a big, grand historical hope. I don't have a picture of the future that convinces me that we're on the verge of a second progressive movement or something like that. But I have to say, I really had fun and felt inspired when I was with these people. It was a very gut feeling being with them. Like, that's why I hung out with them for so long, because they gave me that charge of hope that I don't have when I'm in Washington or Midtown Manhattan or Silicon Valley, which is where the hope is supposed to be, but those are the places that kind of depress me, actually. Yes, sir. I think there's a microphone coming.
One sector you didn't mention was the scientific community in the United States.
Yeah.
And you might think that there's a great deal of hope there. But I would say that it would follow pretty much what you've just said, because you look at some of the great experiments which have been canceled, the budgets are going down. Many of the scientists now are thinking, well, I'll follow the guys in Silicon Valley, start my own company and get rich. So that's declining as well.
Right. I grew up at Stanford University, which is the engine, the motor of Silicon Valley. And when I was growing up, basic research still went on at Stanford. It was funded by the federal government after World War II. And gradually it shifted to the entrepreneurial mode where students, all had to become, had to start up their own company. And that was where Stanford hoped to make money from the research and the patents. There was an article in the New York Times a few weeks back, a couple months, about the decline of basic scientific research. And it made the point that I make in my little riff on celebrity, which is that instead of that, we now have rather eccentric philanthropic ventures by Larry Ellison of Oracle or Eric Schmidt of Google, which may or may not be making breakthroughs in basic science. Probably isn't, because it's a little sexier. It's more like stuff that people want to see happen now rather than 30 years from now. So I think you're right, that once you take away the public support for the sciences, you end up with something that doesn't have that long-term punch. Yes?
You say you're optimistic, you're inspired by some of these,
I didn't say I was optimistic.
or inspired by some of the people that you met.
Yes.
But on the other hand, you've spoken in your talk tonight about how the infrastructure of American society and life have changed dramatically over the past 40 years. And therefore, with these fundamental changes in the infrastructure, how does that counter with these individuals and so on?
Yeah, I mean, I had the constant sense that they were swimming against a very powerful current. And they were on their own. I mean, that's something I haven't talked about yet, but one thing that struck me actually after I finished the book was that every one of the central characters is alone. None of them is in a marriage. None of them has sort of a supportive extended family or community around them. They are trying to figure it out by themselves. They don't have a trade union or a civic association or a church or a newspaper. Dean Price sits in his kitchen on the internet looking up peak oil to try to figure out whether biodiesel is really going to make his fortune for him. And it's a very lonely and solitary picture of people who nonetheless do still have this energy. So I think you're right that what I've described is not anywhere like a countervailing force to these bigger, larger trends. It's just a sign that the heart is still beating. But the aloneness of the people in my book is quite striking and sobering. And I guess all of them point to something in their past that used to exist that sort of supported the aspirations of ordinary people, whether it was a public school or whatever, that no longer really works very well. And that's the sense you have of these structures melting away and people being left to improvise. Yes. I think you had a question here. Yeah, right here.
I understand that by 2008, the healthcare sector had also a huge part of the economy, and I wondered if in your research you found things that also were triggered around 78, changes that made it go from a much smaller part of the economy to something like 17% of the
I guess Americans getting older and sicker, and the fact that the kinds of jobs that used to be there for people with high school educations or 2 years of college were no longer there. In healthcare, everywhere I went, people said healthcare is the only recession-proof field. So that in part of the book I didn't really talk about, which is Tampa, I met a man who went from being a guy who power washed wealthy people's yachts in a marina in St. Petersburg, Florida, to flipping houses in order to try to make a quick killing on the ever-increasing value of housing in Florida, to homeless, or close to homeless, when the housing market collapsed, because there was nothing under his feet. Once he had given up his trade, he finally ended up, in an emergency room and on meds and with a little bit of help from a charity, and now he is a home health aide, making like $9.50 an hour, taking care of a World War II vet. And that's sort of the working class job that a lot of the people I talked to saw as like their best bet, their ticket. That doesn't really answer your question, which is beyond my expertise, actually. But that's an anecdotal answer. Yeah.
Hi, so my question is, how did you select the people that you chose to write about, especially the common people that were not the celebrities? Could you talk a little bit about like the casting process?
Man, I hope it didn't feel like that to them, because I don't think that would have gone over very well. Well, I did have an agenda. There were certain pieces of the big story I wanted. I wanted the Washington story. And while I was working on a New Yorker piece about insider trading, a guy turned up as a source on that who, through our emailing, seemed to have had kind of an interesting career. Biden, Clinton White House, lobbying, back on Capitol Hill in time for the Dodd-Frank Wall Street reform battle. That struck me as perfectly, in line with the story and the chronological frame I had. And so I asked him if he would let me write about him. Absolutely not. He was going to write his own book. This is a problem journalists have today. Everyone is going to write their own damn book, and you can't say to them, but it won't be any good. So his book actually turned out to be pretty good, but gradually over many months and many very tense exchanges, he sort of slowly relented until he said, okay, I'm retired in Savannah. I burned every bridge in Washington. I'm here with a rescue dog. If you want to come down and stay at my house for a week, we could see what works out. So I did that, and the rhythm of those days and nights was we would stay up late into the night, lots of bourbon, and lots of talk meandering through his story, which you can't sort of try to get the chronological version. It will be, you'll lose the thread and you'll get frustrated. You just have to let it go. But he was able to speak anecdotally, which is crucial. And then the next morning, we would run into each other in the kitchen with this kind of hungover look of like, I can't believe, I told you all that last night. And that was, the way that week in Savannah went. And then gradually over the course of the afternoon, we would try to get back to the place where we had been the night before. And that's one version, which is like sit down and just get the whole story out. And his story is a great story. And he ended up being a wonderful collaborator for me on this book. Dean Price was ready and willing. Like, he felt he had a great story to tell me. He also probably felt that I could do him some good. I must have spent, a total of 8 weeks down in Rockingham County, North Carolina, driving all over the state with him, just staying at his house. There was no door on the room I stayed in, which made me nervous. There was also a shotgun in the doorway, which made me, maybe feel better, maybe worse. I couldn't tell how to feel about it. He and I became very close. And so part of the answer is there's a certain trust that builds or doesn't. There's a certain willingness to talk that happens or doesn't. And you don't know until you're there. But once it begins, it's an incredible. You're given this gift, and you have to really treat it very carefully. And part of the careful treatment was because these people, Tammy, Dean, Jeff, had never really. Jeff knew journalists. Tammy and Dean had never really talked to a journalist. I felt I had to let them read what I'd written before I published it, because I just thought they've turned themselves inside out for me. And if there's anything that they really, really don't want in print, I need to know. So Dean's only request was that I remove the fact that in addition to drinking Jack Daniels on his porch at night, he was also smoking a joint, which I hope will not be webcast by the Academy. But it was, of all the things about Dean's life that he might have not wanted the public to know, that one was the easiest to take out. Tammy Thomas read it, and we spent hours on the phone, Laura remembers this, over Thanksgiving 2012, in a really intense conversation in which she said to me, why did you have to write it this way? Why did you need to tell this story so personally? In my family, we don't put our business out there like this. And I had to tell her that there would be no story without the detail, the memory of how when she was 3, she would try to stay awake while her mother was smoking in bed, so that after her mother fell asleep, Tammy would be there to put out the cigarette. How could I not have that story? But how, for her, it was like, why does the world need to know that? And I think we came to an understanding that for me to tell her story, and through her the story of Youngstown, that cigarette had to be in there. There were other things she did ask me to remove, and I did, but that's where the trust is really essential. In the back.
Thanks a lot for the talk. So you mentioned at the beginning that you didn't want to sort of try and tell a grand history because you didn't feel you had the expertise. Tonight there was a lot of secondary history, and I was wondering that in this sort of field where a lot of historians have tried to write about the decline of America, how do you, as a writer, as a generalist, chart a course that is original? How did you negotiate that?
It's a good question. I mean, I was keenly aware that there were many books out there about this subject, broadly speaking, and that there were many good ones. But I was also aware that a lot of them came and went pretty quickly. Either they said what you already believed, and so you forgot about them, or they said something you didn't believe, and so you dismissed it or didn't read it. I did not want to jump into the thick of a political and policy argument and add something shallow and from the hip that would be quickly dismissed. I felt the only way to do what I want to do is to force the reader to give up that kind of thinking and enter a different mode of consciousness, which is a little closer to the mode you're in when you're reading fiction, although I would never claim that this has the, that power of, the unbroken spell. It has moments where I pull back and generalize, and then others where I'm much closer to the characters. But it's a work of nonfiction. But I wanted a work of nonfiction that didn't let you out of the room, which is another reason for not being in there myself. And so I had to talk to my subjects in a way that gave me childhood, and it gave me their parents, and it gave me their education and their jobs and their dreams. Literally, it begins with Dean Price's dream. And that's what I knew I needed in order not to add my little bit to a forgotten pile of worthy books. But it was a big risk, because there was no template for this book. There was no example out there that I knew of in nonfiction for a book that followed a handful of characters over a long period of history against this panoramic background and tried to tell a big story through these small dramas. There was a novel, there was a trilogy called USA by John Dos Passos, which was the closest thing I had to a guide, but that was 80 years ago and it's fiction. So I felt like I was way out there on a limb. Yes.
The people you met, where do they see themselves in the big picture? Do they share your narrative of the panorama you just outlined? Do they believe that they live in the unwinding?
Absolutely. I mean, they know it far better than I do. They taught me about it. They're the ones I learned it from. I mean, I knew abstractly that inequality was a huge problem, but I didn't know what it was like to work at Walmart part-time and try to raise 2 children, the way the Hartzell family in Tampa, who I haven't mentioned, have tried to do, and how they did it in this utter isolation right next to the Air Force Base where Central Command is headquartered. So we have like this immensely powerful military installation, and just a few blocks away, this family living in a terrible little apartment trying to survive. I mean, that, to me, that was my education, was going into their life. So they absolutely feel it. They don't articulate it necessarily in quite the way I have tonight. But none of them has read the book and said you got it wrong. I think they've been struck by how their story might be a little bit like someone else's story. They may see themselves as more connected to the national story than they did before they ran into me. Everyone lives in their own little isolated world most of the time. But they were keenly aware of what was missing, what had been lost in their worlds. And I just heard it over and over. Same phrases. There's no more middle class here. It's just rich and poor. So when you hear that again and again, you really have to pay attention and write it down. And back?
Thank you so much, Mr. Packer. That was brilliant. And it is. I want to know if you look at your work and connect all the dots and to all the many people you spoke, from which of the characters is capable to set up an agenda to save the country?
That's a dramatic question. It's not Newt or Oprah, I can tell you that. One thing about all of them is, over the course of their adult lives, I saw them becoming more conscious. That was part of what drew me to them. These are not people who are just head down, living out every day. I should have said this in answer to the question about how I chose. I partly was drawn to them just because they were thinking about their lives. Something had jolted them out of the normal circle we all go in every day. For Tammy, it was losing her job and having her kids leave Youngstown and finding herself alone and without any living in her mid-40s and having to remake herself, and how becoming a community organizer began to show her what Youngstown had become. She knew it from every day of her life, but she began to see it a little bit more at a distance as a community organizer, and that allowed me to see it through her. For Dean Price, it was this giant leap into biodiesel, getting out of the gas and fast food business. None of them is going to save the country. I mean, I think Dean is the biggest dreamer in the book. He's the one who talks the biggest. He's a salesman. He once said to me, am I a prophet or a huckster? I know there's just a very thin line between those two. He's a classic American type. I mean, that thirst for material acquisition, but also this spiritual questing, totally indistinguishable. It's very American. But none of them, there's no cure. None of them have the answer. I just think it's worth knowing that they're there, and there are unimaginable numbers like them out there. I hope we can talk a little about Europe, because whenever Europeans read my book, they say, the same thing is happening in our country. And that's sort of striking to me, because my fixed idea is that, there's still a cohesion and something of a safety net, and inequality is not as extreme, but this is my view is being pushed in a different direction by the reaction of Europeans. Any other questions? Yes?
Yeah, I also appreciated the talk and the book. The lesson that I thought I took from the book was that that really it isn't individuals that sort of get you out of the mess. It's institutions that, to the degree that we focus on individuals, it's sort of this sort of false hope, and that, like labor unions in the 1930s, it's institutions that enable you to sort of get out of where you are. I read the book, resonated great. I teach in Northeast Ohio, so a lot of the students that I have in college are first-generation college students. The one question I, though, had was, or at least one anecdote that sort of runs against the grain. It's easy to be pessimistic, but if I look, for example, at many of the students that I have, these are students whose parents didn't attend college. Or even if I look at cities, now there's obviously lots of depressing stories about cities, but there's many cities are far better off today than they were in the 1970s. So I feel like there are sort of reasons to be somewhat hopeful. But I'm wondering, are there institutions today that you think might substitute for a labor union?
Yeah. That's a great, two or three great questions embedded in that. And your observation about cities is absolutely right. I mean, think about New York in the 70s compared to the incredibly safe place where we're raising children. They're extremes, though. I mean, they're the New Yorks, and then there's the Detroits. For every city that's come back, there's one that seems to be slipping away. I don't know. I wish I had an answer about institutions, because my book is certainly about how they have grown frail, and yet, how do you build an institution? For example, in my own field, in media and journalism, I think about this a lot. You know, newspapers are wasting away around the country, and at the same time, there's this huge burst of digital startups that, you know, seem to be sucking up the talent and are getting a lot of money from venture capital and are saying we are going to fill the gap left behind by the Kansas City Star, you know, or the Detroit Free Press or whatever. It hasn't happened yet because reporting actually is really hard, costs a lot of money, and doesn't necessarily attract venture money. So that would be, I don't have an answer, but I would say the one that I'm focused on to see if, you know, if the internet and if internet money is capable of rebuilding an old institution rather than substituting something bogus like peer-to-peer networks, you know, or the sharing economy, which I don't think is the answer. That would be it. Looking at digital media to see whether it can do what print newspapers used to do. And it may take years to know. I think we're in this tremendous period of transformation and upheaval where no one can be sure. But I'm, you know, as I think, did David Simon of The Wire say, you know, I know they'll have nothing to worry about when, I think he said, like BuzzFeed or Google or someone shows up at the Baltimore City Council meeting, something like that. That would be one indicator. Who's at the Baltimore City Council meeting? You know, if Vice or The Intercept or one of these digital startups starts doing that, then that's hopeful for all of us.
Two more.
Okay. Yes, Mr. Markovitz.
I have an anecdote which is pessimistic in its political implications. One of our children is an ethicist. She teaches philosophy at MIT. It turns out that a high percentage of the students at MIT are first-time college students and their family from relatively poor working-class families. Almost all of them are libertarians, which doesn't suggest that that group of people are going to generate a political leadership which will favor redistribution.
I think libertarianism, that is pretty disturbing. I think libertarianism is, you know, I mentioned individualism at the end of my talk, and libertarianism is sort of the political label for that strain. And it's really powerful, especially among young people. I think it reflects the fact that institutions no longer hold any, you know, prestige or allegiance for them, and that if I once saw a story that showed a map of the United States with two things laid over each other. One was highest rate of dependence on public benefits, like food stamps, SSI, whatever. And the other was conservative voting patterns. They were in the same places. So that tells you that it may be that part of the libertarian, whether it's Tea Party strain or a more, pro-marijuana strain or whatever, one reason why it may be so powerful, especially among people like that, is that there's a kind of reaction against their own sense of indignity, of being dependent, of having lost the means to support themselves, which is so fundamental to Americans' identity. Rather than loving the government that, they have to go to an office every month to pay their rent through, they hate it. And that's kind of a vicious political circle you just highlighted. So I guess one more question, hopefully one that won't leave us completely catatonic. I think you've had a chance. There was one over here. Yeah.
Yes, hello. One of the characters in your book that you mentioned is Biden. In fact, he sort of plays a fairly large role in your work. And for your book, it capsulized for me ill feelings I had about Biden. And I'm just wondering, did you have a chance to interview him directly? Was all that from your previous experience in Washington?
I've interviewed Biden several times and really enjoyed talking to him, by the way. And it goes on for hours when you sit down with Joe Biden. But that was all through Jeff Connaughton. Jeff Connaughton, was a young, lower middle class kid at the University of Alabama, and Joe Biden came and gave a speech, 1979, and he was sold. He thought, this is Kennedy. This is the man I'm going to follow to the White House. He said that to Biden that year. And sure enough, after a few years working on Wall Street, Connaughton joined Biden's first presidential campaign, which, as you may remember, did not end well with this plagiarism scandal. And it wasn't so much that, but just the sense that Connaughton had that Biden didn't give a shit about him, didn't know his name, treated him with contempt, humiliated him. These are the stories that piled up as we talked and that were borne out by others I heard. So the portrait of Biden is not flattering, but to me, it's entirely Jeff Connaughton's Biden. And if you were to read a biography of him, it would be a different story altogether. And it didn't seem to me to be a story about Biden. It's a story about Washington and how transactional relationships are, and how once Connaughton lost his faith in Biden, he continued to raise money for him, continued to present himself as a Biden guy, continued to trade on that history together because it was useful to him. And it was useful to Biden to have Connaughton out there raising money. By that time, Connaughton really had begun to almost to hate Biden, but he continued. And that tells you something about the glue that holds people together in Washington. So it's not a personal attack on Biden, and I certainly didn't try to get an interview with the vice president in order to ask whether he did indeed call somebody dumb fuck back in 1988. That I don't think I would have gotten very far with that. Biden did release a statement when this came out saying he wished Jeff Connaughton all the best. So that also says something about Washington. All right, thank you all so much.